Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for this afternoon's first panel, which is Where Are We on the Journey to Curing Sickle Cell Disease? My name is Jill Elliott. I'm the Vice President of Cell Therapy Commercialization at Novo Nordisk, and I'm delighted to moderate this fantastic panel and really want to thank ARM for bringing this topic to their agenda for this meeting. So over the next hour or so, we will be discussing with this fantastic panel the multifactorial challenges in bringing next generation or next level transformative therapies to the sickle cell community. As you probably are aware, the drug development challenge, right, is just the beginning of some of the challenges faced in connecting patients with these next level therapies. So I'd like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. Maybe Sandy, starting with you.
Hi, I'm Sandy McRae. I'm the CEO of Sickle Therapeutics.
Hi, I'm Amy Simon. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at Beam Therapeutics.
Hi, I'm Debbie Drane. I'm the Senior Vice President of Global Commercial Development at CSL Behring.
Edmond Chen. I'm Head of Clinical Development at Editas Medicine.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Klima. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Bluebird, and it's good to be back live. And thank you to ARM for hosting this event and Jill for moderating it.
Great, thanks everyone. Yeah, I think we're all happy to be back here live, and great to have this live panel for the discussion today. So you may not know this, but the sickle cell mutation was discovered in 1956, but yet it's taken us decades to really get more therapies to these patients. And we have been fortunate enough to have a couple of approvals in the last few years. So I wanted to open up with a discussion about patients and what they need. To what extent have these new therapies met the unmet needs of patients, and what significant unmet needs still remain? And maybe we'll start with Debbie to take that one.
Thanks, Jill. And yeah, look, it is great to finally see a couple of new products approved for this disease, which obviously hasn't had anything approved in quite a long time. However, I'm sure as anyone would know, even though we have these new products, there's still a significant unmet need. None of the products gives more than a 50% reduction in the vaso-occlusive crisis, and to date, none of them have consistently shown any impact on the multi-organ damage, which is really what leads to the mortality in this disease. So clearly, whilst there have been some advances, and that's great to give physicians and patients some options, there remains a huge unmet need still in the prophylaxis side. And then if we look at the acute setting, there's really no specific treatments for that acute setting. And, you know, as I'm sure you will know, that's an area that, is very difficult for the patients undergoing the pain. And then, of course, the great hope would be cure. Whether we're allowed to use that word or not, I think we'll talk about a bit later. But clearly, whilst you can get, stem cell transplants, that's really only for the most severe forms of the disease. Very, very limited number of patients get that, and it has its own complications. So, we work a lot in haemophilia, and I think back, 50 years ago, haemophiliacs died at about the age of 10 to 12. But with the advent of numerous therapies, and there are 10 or more for those patients, they now lead a fairly normal and healthy life. And hopefully we can do that for sickle cell patients as well someday. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's certainly, we're a little bit behind the hemophilia space for sure, but it does seem that with everyone on the panel is quite active in the drug development space, and that new therapies are coming. But I guess the key question is, what has taken so long? Why is it taking us so long to find effective therapies beyond the drug development challenges? And I wanted to ask Sandy if you would take that one.
I think you're being a little mischievous. The sickle mutation was discovered some time ago, but it's only probably in the past 5 years that genomic medicines have come to the fore. And you can ask why that is, because companies like Sickle have been working on genomic medicines for over 20 years. And it's all the other parts around it. It's the understanding of cell processing. It's being able to sequence. It's being able to deliver your technology more easily. And the exponential growth in genomic medicines is, I think, the phenomenon of the past 5 to 10 years in our industry. We go to hemophilia because there's a lovely connection between the hemophilia gene, the biomarker you can measure in plasma, and the outcome to the patient. And it's somewhat true also for sickle cell disease. It's very clear what the cause of the disease is, and therefore either by replacing that gene or by turning up fetal hemoglobin, you can resolve, or we feel we can resolve the patient's condition. And so it's a very tractable disease. And because we can do it outside of the body, we get rid of the delivery challenge that is the biggest challenge for all forms of editing. So it is something I think we shouldn't look back and say, if only we'd done it in the 50s, but rather be exceptionally proud that many companies are going into an area that has got so many access challenges and commercial challenges, but are doing something that will make an enormous difference to that population.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like as an industry, we're certainly turning the corner into something great. And that's evidenced by all the different therapies and different technologies that are putting into play to attack the disease, and using our knowledge of the disease to take different approaches to that to see if we can get there. I wanted to ask Amy or Edmond if you had anything else to add in terms of the drug development challenges and how gene-edited therapies or gene therapies are well suited for this condition.
I think I'll start by saying, it is a time to sort of celebrate the triumphs and how we got here. And like Sandy was saying, it's only in the last few years that we have a convergence of science with the medical needs. And it comes to a point where you have a disease that's well characterized with clear genetics and natural history. It's also clear in terms of outcome that you have a fairly defined regulatory path. As some of us, as Sandy will know, all the rare diseases that we try to work on, that's not the case in most of them. Getting to where we need to go and how we study them, the regulatory agency will tell you, go ahead, but how do you gauge success? I think, so there's a lot of, the celebration to be done. And the fact that we are all, the colleagues and competitors, it's also a great thing. That means it's going to, at the end of the day, benefit patients. But there are barriers that we have to all overcome. As Debbie started to say, that transplant is not trivial. Yeah. There are things that we need to get over to deliver the best care possible. The fact that we're talking about, if we don't use the C word, is definitive therapy, durable therapy. Yeah. This is a one and done, so it's high risk but high reward. Patients can have normal lives as a result of this. And this is, as a cardiologist that used to do 30, 40,000 patient study, this is very gratifying because I can help someone live a bit longer, but I can normalize and change someone's life for good. This is the ultimate in terms of driving our passion.
Yeah, and I think you're touching on something really important, which is that these therapies can potentially change patients' lives. And one of the most important things I think that in the regulatory landscape that's being covered today is patient-centered drug development, putting patients at the center, understanding patient needs. What is it when people want to live a normal life? What does that mean? What are patients looking for from us in these new therapies? Maybe, Amy, you want to take that one?
Yeah. I just want to also add to a couple of comments. One is I think I've decided Sandy's a cup half full person. I'll give the cup partly empty, which is he's absolutely right that we didn't have enough of an understanding or the tools to actually do the fixes that needed to be done. But it still doesn't kind of hide the fact that there's 3 times more people with sickle cell disease in the United States than there are with CF, and yet there was 7 times the amount of funding. Yeah. So we know that there's disparities that have existed. We have to acknowledge that. I do think, to your point and to Edmond's point, it's a very exciting time because we can get at the root cause now, where I think a lot of other therapies, and people were afraid to go after this because we didn't think we could make an impact. The fact that we can use gene editing gene therapies to actually lower the amount of abnormal hemoglobin S to levels that are quite striking. We can see differences now where, to your point, the latest approved therapies that were not using those approaches, you could barely see a 50% reduction in these veno-occlusive crises. With some of the therapies now, and these are obviously not approved, it's early days, but with our competitors out there, CRISPR, Bluebird, others, we're seeing elimination of veno-occlusive crises. We're seeing a cessation of needing transfusions. These are huge changes that you've been working on for years, and it's absolutely stunning. So I think, for me, having come from a place that worked on RNA interference therapeutics, these kind of changes are exactly the dramatic changes that patients want. But now to tie into your next question, I think what patients really want, and I worked on a disease, porphyria, which had a lot of similarities to sickle cell. The cardinal symptom is pain. There's acute pain, there's chronic pain, there's multi-organ dysfunction, there's chronic opioid abuse. There's people who are not believed and marginalized. There was not necessarily a ton known about the disease, but I can say actually there's more natural history studies, more kind of great data out there from researchers about sickle cell than there ever was about this disease. And we were able to get a drug approved. So I feel very hopeful that if we look at those things like the patient-focused drug development that they had in 2014, where you look at some of the literature that drug companies, academia has done, natural history studies, claims databases, like we're starting to really understand what matters to patients. And yes, veno-occlusive crises are important, but we know that fatigue is a huge complaint of patients. We know that they're worried about if they're gonna live a full life. So mortality, of course, matters. You mentioned, Debbie, the end organ dysfunction. None of us know if these therapeutics that we're developing actually impact that. How soon do you have to treat someone to help that end organ dysfunction either not happen or to halt it? So there's a lot of things that I think patients care about. I would say right up there is their quality of life and ability to function and to have predictability, and we can't underestimate how important that is. So I think, time will tell, both for those therapies that were recently approved, but also for all these gene editing, gene therapies that we're now embarking on. We're gonna need long-term data to really understand how much we're moving the needles on things like fatigue, on pain, and not just the veno-occlusive crises. We're talking about chronic debilitating pain that many of them have, and that really limit their ability to function. And that's complicated because pain is complicated. It's not due to one cause. And so having also worked in a disease where people had pain that was multifactorial, I can say that that's something that we're really gonna have to work on. And it's up to us to incorporate that patient perspective into our trial designs, into the endpoints that we have, and also to make it, I think we heard a talk earlier today by someone, make it not burdensome to the patient to collect that data in their family, because these are people who are already sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so whatever we do really has to kind of make sure that we put the patient at the center of it and help us in our study designs and our operations of our trials.
Yeah, I think you're raising a lot of good points there. You touched on health disparities. You talked about the burdens on the patient. I think, one of the maybe topics that you touched on briefly was collaboration with advocacy. And just was curious if, Tom, if you had any comments about kind of advocacy partnering and how we can partner better with advocacy, or how Bluebird might be doing it already to support the patients in these journeys, because they are arduous ones.
Yeah, thank you. Greetings from way down here on the other end of the stage. It's kind of hard to hear everything, but I just add on to what Amy said. I think even looking at the psychosocial impact, this is a genetic disease that is lifelong and impacts patients and their families, and making sure that we provide surround sound support and that they have access to everything that they would need holistically through their care. And I think you made an important point about the complexities. They've felt marginalized, they've been shoved around and sometimes confused, and making sure that we make it as simple as possible, as clear as possible, and as easy as possible for patients and their families. Bringing something as innovative as cell and gene therapy to market takes a huge partnership, understanding the burden of the disease, understanding the impact over time, the economic impact, and you can only do that through partnerships with advocacy groups, with coalitions, with partners like us on stage and making sure that we're working with patients to understand the impact that the disease has had on their life and the impact that the treatments could have on their life.
Yeah, health disparities is clearly a huge issue for sickle cell patients, and we know that sickle cell community has been underserved. I guess one of the questions that's kind of a bigger issue is what the role of industry is in helping address some of these. Sickle cell is clearly one of the patient populations that could use some equalization. So, Sandy, I was curious if you'd like to talk a little bit about the role of industry in helping support these communities and equalize some health disparities that they're facing.
The role of industry.
The role of the pharmaceutical industry in helping to contribute to, I guess, addressing some of the healthcare disparities that this patient population faces.
That's an interesting question, and to just address my friend's comment, I'm Scottish, so genetically our cup is half empty or less even. and the responsibility as a company, as you go into a field like this, is much greater than I think some of the newer companies realize or imagine. We can't solve the world's problems, and we can't solve disparity and social injustice and lack of access to healthcare. We need to be very clear that that isn't our role. We can help address it, but it isn't our role to solve it. There are 100,000 people in America with sickle cell disease, of which 90% are African American. There are the 10 times the global average number of patients with sickle cell are in Africa, and their access to healthcare is very low. And none of the treatments that any of us here are designing will ever be applicable to Africa. The cost of those treatments means that one can wish and want and dream, but it is just outside the budget of most African countries, all African countries. And so we need to be very fair and clear with the patient populations that we work with to avoid engendering unnecessary hope, but allow them to make sure that they understand what it is we can do and can't do. They understand the process that you have to go through to get one of these treatments, the transplant process and the risks around that, once you've got the treatment, what the hopes are and what the data says, and explain it in a way that is understandable with the patient community. And so we spend a lot of time with our patient advocacy group, with patient support groups, so as it isn't, you're not having a discussion with one patient, you're having a discussion with a community that can explain it amongst themselves. And then there's also a responsibility that I think is rarely talked about in our field, which is long-term follow-up. So we did some HIV studies 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and we're still running the studies to follow those patients, because once you put something into a patient, once you alter their genomic DNA in some way, you have a long-term responsibility to follow up. And those studies are phenomenally expensive. And you have to plan in your company's future to be doing that. So I think we have a responsibility to be fair and balanced in what we say. We have a responsibility to talk to them about what we can do and get their advice, as Amy says, about what's important to them, because what we think is a cool endpoint may not be what the patient really cares about. And then talk to them that this is such an investigational treatment that we will need to follow them long term to understand what happens. That if 20 years from now someone gets AML, that we will all understand that that is just part of the risk of getting AML in the community, rather than a disproportionate rate thanks to the treatment that we did.
Yeah, I think transparency, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to add to that, it's sadly a fact that patients with sickle cell disease have poorer outcomes than a lot of other diseases. They also have less access to healthcare, and I think with other products in disease states, you have this burden pre-commercially to help educate on the burden of disease. I think in the case of sickle cell, we also have to uncover and tease out where the disparities are, and also help to educate, broaden, and make sure that we find solutions to overcome those disparities. It's not enough to just educate on the disease and look at it from that perspective. So I think we need to work together to tease out the disparities and find solutions.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tom. I was wondering too, did you want to also maybe share with us some things you're thinking about in supporting patients along their journey, given that you're a little closer, perhaps, to, since you're in phase 3, if there are other considerations that come into play as you get closer to bringing a commercial therapy to patients and how to help them along their journey?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then we welcome the opinion from everyone else. But again, it's a complex process, and the treatment process is complex. Making sure it's our responsibility to make sure that we remove anything that's a non-clinical barrier. So whether that's access to healthcare, willingness to travel for treatment, or ability to travel for treatment, staying in a hotel for a month or two while you go through treatment, or a lodging facility. All of these things, we need to make sure we have programs in place to take care of patients that need the treatment. Unfortunately, there's a lot of perception around what is deemed as an eligible patient or not an eligible patient. So I think we just need to go above and beyond to make sure that we simplify the process for patients and their families.
Do any other panelists want to comment on that? Or?
No, I just want to say, as we're running these programs, as Tom mentioned, we obviously, as part of clinical trial, provided extraordinary support, and there's travel access that we can do. It's very different when it's actually approved, and you could imagine then the family will have to bring in the resources to undergo that arduous journey, and it's arduous. It takes sometimes a year or more in terms of preparation, frequent visits, and everything else. So not many families can do that. Part of the, I think Amy mentioned the cystic fibrosis, is some of these foundations have tremendous, support that allow some of that to happen. I think this is something that hopefully, the communities of sickle cell disease would sort of come together, and because right now the community is very divergent. And if you even look at the Vasculitis Society, where all the studies are kind of triage, and they look at it as one community, not picking one or the other. So I think there's enough for all of us. We just need, there's ways to help these patients.
Yeah, maybe Jill, I'll add too. I think, Edmond, you raised a really good point about, the fragmentation of some of the support groups in sickle cell, and I do think there's a lot to be learnt from other areas. And whilst we're early stage in sickle cell, we're late stage in haemophilia, and that whole support network, I agree with you. I think there's a real role for industry to really establish that in a much better way together, rather than each company going out and doing it, in their own way.
In fact, ASH is trying to do something, but so far there's not a lot of traction.
Yeah.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
Because if I may, these medicines are very unusual. If we were all developing antihypertensives, the patient could try mine, and if it didn't suit them, try Amy's or try yours. Whereas the patient has one chance. Of course, they could go through it all again, but I think that's going to be very unusual. And therefore, the patient needs to make a choice. And those that have evidence will often be preferred by the patients ahead of those that may eventually be better, but are still in experimental treatment. And I think we all owe it to the patient community to tell our data as plainly and straight as possible, so as proper comparisons can be made.
I do think another thing you guys have all alluded to is once someone goes from a pediatric kind of stage then to an adult, the care gets a little bit more fragmented and less reliable. And right now, a lot of the treatments that we're all developing has been more used in the older age group until we see more safety.
Yeah.
So it's really up to us to think about, hoping that as you start developing more therapies, that the infrastructure and interest in taking care of sickle cell patients gets built with it. And I do think I noticed that in some of the other rare diseases that I've worked on and that others have worked on, that all of a sudden when you start to have therapies and things you can do for it, more and more people get interested in helping or climbing on board or doing research on it. So we really need another generation of like young hematologists and other people who can take care of those people who are transitioning from adolescence to adulthood when a lot of things start to really kind of go wrong. And so, you know, it could be that, you know, the good news is pharma could provide independent research grants for different types of research to study this. They've also done, I've seen some companies give support for access to care because it was so fragmented in COVID-19. I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can work on this. There's also different initiatives, like for example, we talked about the Power Consortium. I know you'll get to this later, but industry's collaborating on that to help educate people, to your point, Sandy, about what trials are available to you. Like if it were me and I had a child who needed something, I would want to be the most educated about all the different trials out there when there's so many. So it's, you know, this Power Consortium is something that the Sickle Cell Disease Society of America has kind of spearheaded, and it's getting a site together, all the research that's going on in the field. What does it mean? It's not kind of branded. It's really meant to be there for the patient and their family members. And if they want to understand what is gene therapy, what does it mean? What's base editing? What's CRISPR-Cas? Like, what are these different therapies that are available now, that are coming down the pike, so that people can make informed decisions? And that's just, you know, something that obviously grew with momentum as more and more pharma came into the space. Now, you know, these things, you know, can be helpful, right? People have more choice. Now we have to educate people about those choices. So, you know, we're all up here kind of thinking about creative ways to work together as well, so that we're not reinventing the wheel.
Collaboration is certainly super important. And Amy, I think you've done a great job highlighting so many different angles on collaboration and what's possible. I am curious whether, with so many drugs in development, whether the hematology community has also been energized by this, and if you found that the level of collaboration has changed over time, is gaining steam. I don't know if that's Edmond.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd defer to people who've been in the space longer. I do feel like my prior experience in a rare disease where the Europeans didn't talk to the Americans, as soon as we got in there and we had a natural history study that covered everyone and we didn't care, the Europeans and Americans started talking and inviting each other to their meetings. And I think, you know, people can drop some of their politicking for the good of science and patients. And so you've been in the space longer. What are you seeing as far as people's interest in going into this space, or hematologists collaborating?
I think the hematologists are excited to have a treatment that offers such benefit to the patient. So I think they're delighted to see the number of options, because, you know, there's 100,000 patients. Even if all of our drugs were approved, would we have enough resources and cell manufacturing capability to look after these patients? Probably not. We need all of us to be out there.
I think that level of collaboration is true across the board, across therapeutic areas, that, you know, when we move out of the United States, we often find delight how people are yearning for innovation. I think in this particular, what I'm seeing, it's fairly makes things a little more difficult and challenging, but you know, Sandy will appreciate, is that, you know, with all the manufacturing everything out, to set up the, you know, chemo manufacturing facility, in this particular case in sickle cell, is one patient at a time. It's a very big lift. And then with the onerous EMA, you know, the regulations and so forth, and it becomes, you know, sometimes really prohibitive. So we do have to be measured about how we start, and sometimes go there later.
Thank you. The one stakeholder maybe we haven't talked about yet in terms of collaboration is the government payer, and we know that the sickle cell community is disproportionately insured by government payers. So I wanted to ask if, you know, what type of conversations are we having with government payers to help support us on our journey to curing sickle, and what challenges are we hearing from them? Maybe, Tom, if I could ask you to take that one?
Yeah, sure, I can start, and then happy to get any other input. We all know that resources are wildly constrained and only getting worse right now with things like COVID and the threat of a government shutdown. Focus and resources and attention is stretched as thin as it ever has been. And so it's key to have early engagement, and the early engagement focused on not only education of some of the disparities and the burden of disease, but also a partnership and a collaboration in terms of talking about and looking to alternative payment models and also alternative solutions. And I think the only way to accomplish that is to engage early, because as we all know, the approval process and the process to get some of these things done is lengthy. So we've been out there for years now. Some of that is intentional, some of that is not necessarily our fault or intentional, but we've been out there talking to payers and engaging early and getting feedback and thinking through not only innovative solutions, but also practical and implementable solutions.
And perhaps, Jill, I'd add that, you know, I think we've got to sort of help educate our payers and public affairs officials around value and not just cost. You know, I think, as Sandy said, this is an expensive therapy. You know, it's not a pill. But it brings great value not only to the patient, but to their caregivers and to society in general, potentially. And until we really know the durability, that's a difficult discussion to have with payers who perhaps have a much shorter term focus. So I think, you know, there's a lot of engagement required, and to Tom's point, you do have to start early, because together we have to really understand the true value these therapies can bring to everybody.
Tom, Bluebird have spoken about payment over 5 years, and how's that working? Because I think we're all watching to try and learn from it. Are you managing to track the patients and keep them in the system over that period?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly have a little bit of experience with that. We originally were speaking about payment over time, probably leading with payment over time, and our goal is really to achieve access and make sure that patients have access to medicines. Payment over time should be seen as one option, and we should maintain optionality. The honest reality is that a lot of payers and governments are not set up for payment over time, and implementing something like payment over time takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of resources, takes additional resources in an already constrained environment. So if that's something that a payer or a government wants to do, we're open to that. But we found so far that the vast majority do not, and they don't want to take the time or the resources to implement it. Kind of like Debbie said, it's kind of a trade-off between the short-term shock of something and the resources it takes to accomplish it versus the long-term potential benefit. And also keep in mind that patients, at least in the United States, change payers a lot. You know, so they'll switch plans, and all of a sudden payer signs up for payment over time, and the patient is with a different payer shortly thereafter. So there's been a lot of challenges. I think that's a great long-term potential goal, but in the short term, very challenging.
Yeah, certainly some operational challenges. And I think, you know, one of the points made earlier by Debbie around the value, I think, is a really important one, just given the magnitude of that payment sometimes, especially if we can't operationalize payment over time. So I was curious about the partnership with advocacy or professional healthcare associations to support that value, the underpinnings of the value. How important are they, and are we having some success in those partnerships to help support the value story?
Yeah, and I can start, but I'm happy to get input. It's imperative. I mean, I think you have to have surround sound, so to speak, from those closest to the disease, whether that's support groups, patients, advocacy groups, and the healthcare professionals that deal with sickle cell disease. So I believe that it's paramount that we not only engage different groups and form different groups to help understand the burden of disease, but also, as we talked about earlier, some of the discrepancies and disparities within the system. We've actually at Bluebird formed a coalition starting with the Black Women's Health Imperative and the Black Nurses Association of America, and really launched a lot of tactics and digging into some of the disparities So I think that's just one example of where we can start to shine light on some of the burden of disease issues and disparities in the healthcare system.
Great, thank you. So I guess we can get back to the title of our panel today, which is Where Are We on the Journey to the Cure? And I wanted to just ask the panel, I think it was Edmond who mentioned the C word. Should we even be using the C word, the cure word, given the importance of setting the right expectations with patients, not overpromising? So I wanted to ask the panel, how challenging is it to define a cure for sickle cell disease? And is there any alignment on the clinical outcomes that we need to achieve to help support that kind of a message?
Well, since I mentioned, I would say it's actually fairly straightforward. It's just the bar is very high. As Amy just mentioned, it's very clear. It's what you call, complete response or complete resolution. It's what, if there's a multitude of options out there, you want the best, right? And best means zero events in the future, and which is what complete response means in terms of clinical outcome. And then when it comes to surrogate or mechanistic outcomes, you're looking at with variety of whether or not you're using an HbF type strategy. There are ways in which you could quite easily measure. This is what the beauty of this particular disorder is. One that, as remember the medical school days, is one of the first smears we ever learned. One of the things that you can just pull up and see, and this is as simple as that. But getting there is much more difficult. The measures are simple, but how you get there and whether it's durable will be the key of success.
And just to add to that, Edmond, I think we've talked a little bit about the complexity of sickle cell disease. And sickle cell, as I mentioned earlier, is a lifelong genetic disorder that has a lot of complications and lifetime issues that go along with it. And being the commercial guy, I love to use the word cure, but I think we need to be careful in using one term that might unintentionally simplify a pretty complex disease. And we might cure one thing, but from patient to patient, they might have several other comorbidities or other factors to deal with. So I think it's with sickle cell disease kind of a challenging term to answer your question, something that I think we strive for and is the aspiration, but given that individual patient results vary, I think we just need to be careful with that and work with the healthcare community and patients to help us define it.
Yeah, I think it's one thing. I just want to add it's one thing. I think Amy made the point. If you start early and you treat a young patient, indeed, it was going to transform a life and the family, I would argue, and that would be probably as close to a cure as you get. But when you actually, treat someone who is older, who deserves of treatment, but will already have sustained, the sequelae due to the multitude of insults from the condition, it's, cure in that case would probably not, be, justified, at least the use of the word, and there are other treatments that still required. Because we're all fighting of the pristine patients, but there are very few of them. But most of them, even at a young age, have their abnormalities on the MRI, abnormal PFTs. You cannot imagine someone who gets hospitalized with pain crises, with vaso-occlusive events, live till 30 and would have no organ damage. That just doesn't happen, and which is a sad state of affairs, which in the next few years we could change, but there still be a large population of not sort of not ideal candidate for transplant that we could help. But that's where the science needs to improve.
I think we are also excited because we can do a genetic fix, right? Like you can take and swap out a defective gene and put in one that is a variant of normal, or you can edit that base so that now they don't have hemoglobin S, they have a variant called hemoglobin G that's non-pathologic. So that to me is like you've cured their genetic defect, but have you cured their whole syndrome and disease? And I think it gets at all of what we've said, which is it depends when you treat, because some could have a very severe crises or a stroke as a very young child, and if you intervened after that, it's very hard to get that neurocognitive function back. And so saying that you have a clinical cure is a much more difficult thing than to say you have a genetic cure. And so I think we just have to be very careful. I think most patients would probably agree they're cured if they're not in the hospital having veno-occlusive crises, they're not tired, they're not needing transfusions, their quality of life is better, they are living to a normal age. I mean, I think we could put out like what people would consider a cure, almost like 99 out of 100 people in the room. I think the problem is like, when do you have to treat to get that outcome? And we're going to need so much more data to feel comfortable with the benefit risk in young children. And then, to others' points, this is an arduous process when you undergo an autologous transplant and getting ready for it and getting genotoxic conditioning and those things. So to everyone else's point, if you already have very later stage disease, you're not going to necessarily get this either. So it then gets at, well, what's the next generation? And the thing is, can we get rid of the transplant? That is something we're interested in doing at Beam, which is to deliver directly the editing tools to the hematopoietic stem cell and get rid of the need for the transplant. And that may open up, this is like the science fiction holy grail, right? But this is things that we're not the only ones working on. Many companies are working on trying to deliver this editing directly to the hematopoietic stem cell. So now you don't need transplant centers. So now maybe more places in the world could use this. It's still going to be expensive, but the cost of goods are going to be far lower. And then you don't need to have people who are experienced in transplant, and then you don't have to necessarily go through the genotoxic conditioning. So I would say this is a great step in the right direction, but I think we're going to keep kind of iterating until the risks of these procedures are lower and lower and the benefits are higher and higher.
And we need to take our time because it's such an important thing we're doing with patients. And I think most of our genetic cures aren't even genetic cures, they're genetic workarounds. Eventually, as you say, we will replace a gene with what is perceived to be normal. And there again, there's a whole discussion about what does it mean to have a normal gene, what SNPs should it include and what should it not include. But I think I would even push it further. I think there's a need for a conversation with the patient community about what they interpret as cure. If I had a disease where I was having these occlusive events on a weekly or monthly basis and you took it away from me, I'd tell my friends in the pub, you cured me. And it may not be a cure, and they may still have the old disease, and they may even still have undetectable accumulation of small events that leads to more disease. But we need to be careful that we don't get caught up in a technicality here.
I think what I would like to say is it's life restorative.
I would agree with
think that one thing I heard about people in another disease I worked on was the therapeutic before we got there saved their lives, but the treatment that we developed was life restorative. They were getting back to doing what they were meant to do. These are young people who should be working and should be going to school and should be, getting their dreams, but they're limited. And so can we restore their ability to function and to have a life they were meant to lead? I think everyone can agree that would be a goal, a high bar.
Sometimes we forget the patients that we remember, the ones that end up in the hospital, the sickest, and have a variety of conditions and social, economic, and otherwise. But then it's very humble when you talk to the actual people who take care of these patients on a longitudinal basis. What you see is that there are actually a lot of people who are actually highly functional, and but have to do all sorts of things to just make sure that they get the right treatment. I've heard of people, dressing up and do, in suits and ties and just to get into the hospital. Otherwise, they won't get the, pain treatment or treated differently. I think that's where, a treatment is going to save a life, save a family, save a community, because it will allow someone not just to restore life, but restore dignity.
Yeah, and I think as Sandy said, though, we need to talk to the patients about what it means to them. You know, we've historically thought of ourselves as a patient-focused company, but we used to go out and talk to patients, and then we'd bring those learnings inside and we'd make all the decisions about what that meant. Whereas now, particularly with our sickle cell study, you know, we bring the patients in and have them sitting at the table while we make the decisions on what we might do in a clinical trial. And I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity. They want to engage generally, I've found.
Yeah. So patient education, patient selection, really being transparent, all of these are common themes that I'm hearing. We have commitments to follow patients for 15 years on gene and cell therapies. How are we thinking about using that data to help inform patient selection, to help inform, say, the treating community on who could be maybe best suited for the therapy? Because, of course, not everybody will be successful.
We don't have enough data yet.
I think this is where you used to do a 10,000, 20,000 patient, data. That's where you could do, tremendous amount of data mining. But individually, each of us would be, Bluebird being the exception, we will be enrolling 10, 15, 40, 50 patients for our entire registration, the program. So we won't be able to individually to do much. But
is this a non-competitive space? Is this something that we should...
No, but this is what I'm going to say is at the end of the day to help with payer, help with identification, this is where some pooling or some data sharing at the end of the day would benefit us all. Mm-hmm. There may be certain treatments that are better for older patients, stroke patients, and the fact that we treat patients one at a time. I always argue there's enough room for us, that no one can quite monopolize at least in the near term, not the way it is going to be treated. But this is where the power comes in. With each of us, it just I've been asked this question. I might as well forget it. It just can't be done with a small number of patients.
I do think you're right, though, that like after people, drugs may be approved, but we're going to be following people for 15 years. And that's like a gold mine of information, like about who has more normal red blood cell function. Does that more normal red blood cell function correlate with, near-term outcomes, longer-term outcomes? Everyone wants to understand that. What is restitution of red blood cell function enough to prevent that ongoing organ damage? And so we don't have biomarkers yet, to really understand who's going to progress, who's not going to progress. Why do some people have VOC, some people don't? It's like, I think if we combine all the data that we're going to be generating, I think we will have some better understanding about that, who goes on to progress. Are there biomarkers for this or not? And with our therapies, can we tease out, let's say, I'm just making this up to be competitive. Let's say my therapy is like amazing and I show like, that end organ function, doesn't happen if you treat it, blah, 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 but like another therapy.
Amy, you'd have to be in the clinic for that.
I'm in the clinic, but anyway, but let's just say I do see patients half day a week, but still, I get your point. But I'm just saying, let's say we do show something like that. We can then start to, and there's another example, let's say we can start to kind of get together data sets of ideas about what degree of red blood cell function translates into what degree of kind of prognosis or organ function. So, I mean, we're building incredible data sets that we couldn't have imagined doing before because we couldn't get hemoglobin S levels down to the levels that we are doing without transfusions chronically.
Now, I'll give you a specific example where it doesn't impact on sharing proprietary information. I'll pick on Tom a bit, because of the issue about the conditioning and the potential for secondary malignancy. And one would ask, why is it with sickle cell and not beta thalassemia? Is there something that one could learn? Again, this is where that issue impacts all of us. Mm-hmm. And if conditioning leads to malignancy, because it's not our therapy, it's a concomitant treatment. And this is precisely the one of the areas where we could all benefit from a bit of sharing.
And it's why the role that Bluebird has played here is so important, being the first company to do something like this. And first people to write the protocol, describe the patient, you're going, that's the hardest thing to do. It's easier for everyone that follows up and can learn from you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of benefits to going first, but there's also a lot of challenges associated with that. But I do think that, to Edmond's point, you continue to evolve over time, and you look at different strategies like reduced toxicity conditioning, or like off-the-shelf CAR-T, or like in vivo gene therapy, or cryopreserved product, or things that can not only help improve the delivery, but also potentially the safety and efficacy and outcomes.
I mean, we've talked about in vivo, moving to in vivo, but now that we're ex vivo, there still will be, we've talked about a lot of challenges already in kind of taking this from a patient population that only a few thousand get transplants today to really opening this up to more patients. And I guess I'd ask a question around what do we think of all the challenges we've talked about today? What will be, you know, in your opinion, the maybe top 2 things that we need to get right to really be able to bring this to a broader group of patients before we get to the, you know, direct in vivo stage?
Yeah, I mean, initially, just value recognition. I think you have to establish the burden of disease and the course of the illness, and then establish the value. And unfortunately, I think a lot of payers and governments are not ready for a one-time, one-and-done, potentially curative therapy, and they don't recognize that value. So making sure that you take the time, you take the energy and the efforts to establish the value, and I'll leave it at that. And any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, I'd perhaps add I completely agree about the value, Tom, because it's so new to the systems that aren't really set up for it. The other thing that I think we really have to get right, though, as well, is really the whole logistics. You talked about the arduous journey, Edmond, and it really is, right? And so we have to get that, you know, I think we have to get that right, or people won't want to sign up for these therapies.
Yeah, like we had a potential patient who works night shifts. How do you make it happen? It just there's just the economic, social things that we cannot overcome. I can't give him a job, right? You know, and how do you bring this to patients?
Well, I think that concludes the panel discussion. I want to thank our great panelists for their perspectives today. Please join me in thanking them. If there's any questions from the audience, we have a few minutes to take those.
I'll ask a question. So I think the panel did a really good job of talking about the importance of patient education and perhaps managing expectations. What does that conversation look like for the parents of patients, though, but parents of a very young patient who's ill? Does that change that conversation?
So I think the question is around how are you transparent with the patient, with the parents of a very young patient? How does that change the conversation? Because we talked a lot about transparency today.
I think obviously it's imperative. When a parent is making a decision for a child, it's not only the care that they're choosing to select, but even things like fertility preservation, and are parents willing to make that decision for their child? So there are many opportunities to better educate or to communicate with the families of patients, but also the patients as well. So I think that it's critically imperative.
No other questions? Okay. All right. Thank you very much for joining us.